Hey guys, Hashi here. Today we will be covering the various types of gods of the Warhammer mythos. To clarify, this is not some list of all of the gods within the verse, as that'd be a quite long and boring video in my opinion. Instead, today we will be looking at the various categories of gods and what separates them from each other, so that you can read into your favorite niche god yourself. I don't plan on covering the types of god beasts in this video, since they are a can of worms in it of themselves. So in White Dwarf issues 443 and 444, we are told in the Worlds of Warhammer sections of those two issues about the two categories of gods, Ascendant gods and Elemental gods. I think Elemental gods are aptly named, since the Elementals of old are basically just demons made from the wind of magic, per the Winds of Magic supplement for 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy roleplay. This ties it back to the older pieces of lore where the Chaos gods are called the Demon gods, since as we know the Chaos gods make demons by extruding a piece of themselves. So in reality they are gods of demons in the same way we are beings made of cells. Now, while I appreciate these categories and they do have some use, I don't plan on only using them in this video, since the Elven gods, the Dark King, Be'lakor, and a few others kind of break this classification. I think we should see these categories not as rigid boxes things have to fit into, but rather as rough guidelines most things will generally fit into. To start this video off, let's cover some folks who ought to be talked about in this video about gods, that being the Old Ones. Now, there is actually a whole excerpt in Tome of Salvation discussing if the Old Ones are gods. In this passage we hear about the in-universe discourse regarding Elven mythology supposedly contradicting the accounts of the Old Ones. Now I think the best way to resolve this is something I covered in my last video, that being the Old Ones incepting the idea of the Elven gods into their template races to serve as thought weapons to defend them. Needless to say, I don't think there's anything wrong with calling the Old Ones gods. The Seraphon worship them like gods after all. The first rough grouping of gods we will cover will be the Elemental gods. In the aforementioned Worlds of Warhammer article, it describes them as taking form in a realm beyond reality, and being personifications of specific phenomena. This is a very elegant description and works for a lot of these gods. Of course, what this phenomena is becomes kind of muddled with Gorka Morka and the various aspects thereof. Within Age of Sigmar, there are 4 grand alliances: Order, Death, Chaos, and Destruction. Now all of them infight and are really just ways to let you use multiple armies that should reasonably work together in the lore. Of these, Destruction is the one that stands out since, as stated in Soulbound, it is ultimately a meta term you really wouldn't see used in the universe. So the Orc gods, yes, gods plural, I don't just mean Gork and Mork either. These gods that derive their power from the collective Wa of the green-skinned races, including the Spider God and the Bad Moon. The Wa is effectively the collective urge of the green-skinned races that usually tends to be destructive. The Spider God in particular gained power after allegedly eating some of Gorka Morka's flesh, per Soulbound Champions of Destruction. What's interesting about this apotheosis is that in White Dwarf 459 they say the spider was a god beast prior, which does beg some questions. In more recent times, the UFC division we call Pantheon of Destruction received another member, Kragnos. Kragnos is an ancient entity of the mortal realms elevated to power by the worship of greenskin races, which is why he is lumped into this grand alliance, along with him just being destructive in general. He is also outright called an Ascendant god in the recent White Dwarf 501. Next we move on to the part that most people know about already, the ruinous powers of chaos. As odd as it may sound, I don't think there's much to go over here. Khorne is the god of bloodshed, Tzeentch is the god of change, Slaanesh is the god of excess, and Nurgle the god of decay. Of course, all of these gods are multifaceted, more likely in part due to them consuming other gods during their time at the court of the Covenant, but that's something I talked about in my creation myth video. In 40k, there's been a bit of a kerfuffle as of late with the want-to-be god Vashtorr. The first real qualm people have with Vashtorr is that they think it's some kind of ass pull for the Soulforged to have a ruler and for it to be significant. But if you read the 4th edition Chaos Demons Codex, it lays out what Vashtorr is pretty blatantly. In Arcs of Omen Vashtorr, we learn that Vashtorr still has competitors for his rule of the Soulforged, so it is more than likely once he absorbs and or destroys them, that he can ascend to be a proper Chaos God. I say this because Chaos Gods are their territory within the Warp. While Vashtorr might be part of the Soulforged, he hasn't quite conquered all of it yet. This makes sense too with what we see with the Screaming God Child, where Chaos Undivided is seen as a godless wasteland. So to become a Chaos God and thus have territory within the Warp, you must properly divide Chaos. This theory is supported by the fact that in the 4th edition Chaos Demons Codex, the Soul Grinders entry says that the Soulforge is within the formless waste of the realm of Chaos, and in more recent lore is depicted as a much more independent force of Chaos. In Imperial Armor 13, this is backed up with an undivided demon prince carving out his own domain within the Warp, not too dissimilar to Be'lakor. In much more recent lore, more specifically White Dwarf 501, we are told that Magnus the Red foresees a future where Vashtorr ascends to godhood, meaning that Vashtorr, in all honesty, has as much of a chance of becoming a god as Ynnead does. Of course, by chance, I mean the probable timelines within the Warhammer mythos, not including any corporate meddling or supposed mandates about the timeline being stagnant or something like that. Another recent addition to the Pantheon of Chaos, this time from Age of Sigmar, would be the Great Horned Rat. While the chaotic origins of the Rat Men are nothing new, one of the stories about the origin of their chaotic nature is that during the God War, the rats feasted upon the Chaos Gods and thus became chaotic themselves. This wouldn't be too far off from the story about the Spider God of the Greenskins. In a recent White Dwarf, we have been told that Blight City is a splinter of the Realm of Chaos, which makes sense as in the Skaven Battle Tome, Blight City is considered to be its own domain in the Realm of Chaos. Likewise, the Realm of Ruin, which contains the Skaven Afterlives, is separate from Shyish, the Realm of Endings. I think the unifying theme here between the Spider God and the Great Horned Rat is they both had to consume some kind of elemental energy, and then they were able to become gods in their own right. This may reflect how any new god of the warp has to use part of chaos in order to eventually become a greater deity, due in no small part to chaos's dominance over the warp, with the thought being that the entire warp is chaos. I suspect the reason the Great Horned Rat isn't considered part of the Great Game by the other ruinous powers is due in part to his realm being depicted as under the Realm of Chaos, thus is like including the sewers as part of your property. Aside from the gods of chaos, we also have the classical gods of Warhammer Fantasy. They seem to operate as you'd expect the Greek gods to, with a god of the sea, god of death, and so on. Unlike chaos, it is more normal to treat them as an entire pantheon, with followers of Mor, the god of death, accepting that people may follow other gods, but in the end all souls will go to Mor. Although we do know there are afterlives for other gods, like the Hells of Cain, there are of course people who deny this type of thing in universe though, like we see in Liber Necris. With these warp gods, people will believe one thing, and then we end up being told that is the opposite. For example, we are told no one aside from chaos cultists would tell you that chaos and the classical gods come from the same metaphysical realm. Then we are told they all come from the warp in other sources. Of course, like all gods in the warp, they do have their own realms, with not all of them explicitly being afterlives. What's fairly interesting is that like the Chaos Gods, whom have explicitly devoured other gods and thus have ended up with multiple aspects, the classical gods are thought to have aspects in the form of minor deities of the old world. It has been explained that when a new god is found within some local township, the priests of the 9 major cults will chalk it up to being an aspect of one or more of their gods. It is noted later that the line between minor deity and venerated soul is quite blurry, which of course does blur the line between Ascendant and Elemental God. Some of you may be asking, well, what about Nuffle? Well, Nuffle is called a cousin of the Chaos Gods, so I think he is a god of the warp. Within Blood Bowl, the gods of law are also mentioned, which are really just warp gods of the old ones, as I mentioned in my creation myth video. I think Nuffle is closer to a classical god than he would be a god of law, but nonetheless he is a god of the warp, in my opinion. There are some neat additions to all these categories, like the Kroot gods, which we have seen in Liber Xenologus, or the blossoming Tau god of the greater good. I should add that one of the big reasons that non-chaos warp gods are fairly rare in 40k is that the Imperium has gods outside of the Emperor, outlawed, and that the Elder gods are largely dead. Despite being dead, I suspect that the Elder gods will at some point be reborn due to their cyclical nature, as I talked about in my creation myth video. On that note, I think we should talk about Ynnead, the Eldar god of the dead. Ynnead resides in a realm beyond the warp, feeding upon the souls of the Eldar from their infinity circuits, so that Slaanesh cannot have them. There is this idea that once Ynnead slays Slaanesh, that the still alive Eldar gods will be freed from Slaanesh's gullet. Aside from warp gods, we also have gods whom were mortal at some point and have just mantled some kind of power. These would be Ascendant gods. The obvious examples of this would be the incarnates from the End Times, which eventually became gods in Age of Sigmar. For example, Karl Franz, the Emperor of the Empire in Warhammer Fantasy, during the End Times absorbs the Wind of Azir, which also had the essence of Sigmar within it. You could debatably say the Emperor of Mankind from Warhammer 40k falls here as well, but I think he is one of those edge cases. I am including the Dark King when I say the Emperor, since the Emperor is a perpetual, i.e. mortal to some extent. Even the current Emperor, or Starchild, shouldn't really be classified as an elemental god, in my opinion. Especially since we've seen in the 40k novel for Angron, it seems to imply that elemental gods don't really need worship, and one of the more potent abilities the Imperium has is faith, with it even ignoring the pariah nexus of the Necrons. If born, I do think the Dark King would have been a proper elemental chaos god, but I don't think that excludes the fact that it came from the Emperor doing his speedrunner skips before fighting Horus. As I noted earlier with the Spider God and the Great Horned Rat, a common theme seems to be that you have to eat some of chaos. This would also be consistent with what we learned about the Emperor in The End in the Death, where he stole fire from the Chaos Gods on Molech, and during his fight with Horus he'd keep stealing power. It wouldn't surprise me if instead of a proper deal with the Chaos Gods, if when the Emperor took fire from the Chaos Gods, it was kind of like a hook the drug dealers from those government PSAs would give out. You take in the energy of chaos in hopes you will one day ultimately expand chaos with said power, one way or another. The last group of gods I would like to talk about are the Star Gods or the Catan. So the Catan are strictly gods of the Materium, being described as the living soul of the universe. This is in contrast to almost every type of god we have mentioned thus far, which have had something to do with magic or the warp. What's especially neat about the Catan is that they are fundamental concepts of the universe, which means they have a unique form of immortality. Due to this unique form of immortality, the Catan are only shattered when fighting other gods like Cain, the exception here being the Flayer, who was completely destroyed. Unfortunately, we don't know what concept the Flayer embodied, or if the Flayer virus is a result of his complete destruction as opposed to just being something the Catan did in its death throes. The lore is actually pretty vague about that one. I guess we should talk about the elephant in the room, or rather dragon in the labyrinth, the machine god of the Adeptus Mechanicus, or rather the Void Dragon that is imprisoned on Mars. In a short story about the Man of Iron, UR25, we are explicitly told that the Omnissiah is not the Emperor. This makes sense, especially what we learn in the book Mechanicum about the Emperor putting the Void Dragon on Mars to spur the technological development of the planet. I should note that at the time of the novel being written, Mechanicum that is, the Void Dragon was not a shard. It was a full Catan. Even as far back as the 3rd edition Necron Codex, we did hear of something being on Mars. If you want to call this whole shard thing a retcon, it is understandable. However, I don't think it changes much either way, since even with the Void Dragon having a model currently, there aren't many plot points that require it to just be a shard and thus have shards everywhere. Anyways guys, that's going to be it for this video. Can't wait to see you all in the next one. This video was quite an undertaking to make, as I got sidetracked with multiple rabbit holes. With all these gods, there's so many things you can look into. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see y'all in the next one.